days with the everyone in their video. It's been really great because generally there's not that many people that have their video on.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's really good for you. I'm going to go ahead and let everyone in. Have a great session.
Okay, thank you. You seeing my screen?
All good. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Join me in welcoming Dr. Gibbons.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hear you just got done with lunch. Hopefully you had a good one, a little bit of time to relax. I was just looking at all the sessions for the conference, and boy, is it packed with some good ones. So thanks for joining me today to talk about fidelity of implementation. My name is Kim Gibbons, and I'm coming to you from the Midwest, from Minnesota. Currently, I work at the University of Minnesota, and I'm the director of a research center called CARI, the Center for Applied Research and Educational Improvement. I've been here for 10 years, and prior to that, I spent 20 years working as a school administrator for a group of 6 school districts here, and really led that group of districts in implementation of the multi-tiered system of support framework well before that was even a term. So love to talk about fidelity because I think it's often the missing link in the MTSS framework, because it's all fine and great to have implementation plans of different things that we're going to do to implement, but if we don't have data to know how we're implementing, it can make decision-making a little bit challenging. So I am going to share with you a broader conception of fidelity that I developed with a colleague of mine probably about 10 years ago. So happy to be here today and chat with you. There are some links I have some links to some resources that you might find good to take a look at other times. That any link that I'll share today will also be embedded into the PowerPoint, but there's a fidelity resource folder that has a bunch of different things related to fidelity. We also developed a fidelity resource guide at my center. Our center, I didn't tell you, you probably heard I'm a director of a research center and you think I sit behind my computer and do research all day, but I actually don't do research. I spend most of my time helping school districts apply research to practice, and so do a lot of work around MTSS and specifically literacy. I've been working with Berkeley Unified School District. I'm in my 2nd year out of 3 years, helping them implement structured literacy, and they're rocking it over there. So happy to be with you. So I am interested if in the chat you could write, when you think about the term fidelity, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? What's your personal definition of fidelity? And Roberta, I might have to have you read me the chat because my chat just disappeared. So I don't want to end the PowerPoint to try to find it. Do you see any definitions coming in?
Not yet. It sometimes has a little delay. I'm sure there's going to be one in there.
What's your definition of fidelity? Oh,
Doing
here.
something according to research and also individualized for each task.
Awesome. Faithfulness to a plan or agreement. Love that. So a lot of the work that I've probably been doing, I don't know, for the last 15 years or so, is I will go out to a district that wants some help collecting information on how well they're implementing the framework. And so I will talk with every building team. I collect some existing information and data. I'll look at student achievement data, attendance data, just a variety of information to help inform where they're at. And there's no judgment, because when we're implementing MTSS, everyone needs to start someplace. And we are always operating under a continuous improvement framework. So we're not going to be at full implementation right away. So most of the districts I work with are at a partial level of implementation, but the thing that's missing about 99% of the time is any direct information about how we're implementing. And it's so important within a continuous improvement framework to have data on fidelity. And I'm going to tell you what my definition of fidelity is in a minute. But fidelity can refer to a lot of different things. But we need to have some information to let us know, like, are we really doing what we intended to do? And if we're not, it's not to hang our heads and do the walk of shame, because life happens in schools, right? And it's some barrier presented itself that was unexpected. And so really the challenge is, if things aren't going well, to figure out, well, what were those barriers that we didn't anticipate? And once you can identify the barriers, it becomes much easier to figure out what the solution is. So I asked you your definition. There's the term fidelity is used in a lot of different ways. You might hear the term intervention fidelity, referring to tier 2 and tier 3 interventions. You may hear treatment integrity, intervention adherence, intervention integrity. And, it all means, in a nutshell, the degree to which a planned intervention is implemented as defined. That definition is from 1991, and it's a little bit more of a narrow definition. I like to think of fidelity as a system of interrelated components that are all going to impact the outcome that we're concerned about. So I'm going to share with you my broadened definition. But before I do that, I think it's really important to understand that by measuring fidelity, in my early days when I worked for my group of 6 school districts, we made a change in 2005 from identifying students with a learning disability for special ed. The old way of doing it was to administer an IQ test and then administer an achievement test and then look to see if there was a big enough difference so that kids would qualify. And that type of an approach has a lot of flaws. So when the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was reauthorized in 2005, there was actually language in there at the federal level that said states could no longer force districts or require districts to use that old approach. And instead, they could use data to determine whether or not students were responding to evidence-based practices, and use data from what we now call the MTSS framework to help make eligibility decisions. So I moved away from that. I was the only district in Minnesota that moved away in 2005. And our Department of Ed didn't even put out new rules for the new way until 2010. So fidelity became really important to me for that process, because I didn't want, when we're making a special ed entitlement decision, that's a big decision. And I didn't want to just, I wanted to make sure that we were following our new process with integrity. So I had all of our there was like 22 buildings across the 6 districts. And that year that we switched over, I had them come in 4 times a year, just as a way to answer questions and make sure we were all on the same path. And I remember maybe the second session of the year, there was about 60 people in the room, and I asked, would anybody like to share either positive feedback about how things are going or concerns that you have? And there was a woman sitting in the back of the room, and her face was red. I knew this person. She had like a bulging vein in her forehead, so I could tell she was upset. And she raised her hand and then stood up and said, I just need to tell you that I've been a teacher for 25 years, and I am insulted that somebody would come into my classroom and observe an intervention that I've been doing for well over a decade. I find it very insulting, and I'm sure that I'm not alone. So, there's kind of quiet in the room, and I said a couple of things, and this is what I want to make really clear today, is that when we talk about fidelity, it is in no way, shape, or form an evaluation of the teacher. It's an evaluation of the system and whether we are providing enough support to interventionists to deliver interventions, in this case, with fidelity. She didn't like that answer, though. So then I said, well, here's the other thing. I'm trained as a school psychologist. I don't know if there's any school psychs in this session, but back in the 1990s, we were trained to administer standardized tests. With some of you maybe have administered like the Woodcock-Johnson, and there's an easel, and you have to read the words just as they say, and you point when it says point, and it's all scripted. But there is this phenomenon in psychology called observer drift. And I think it applies to more than just testing. When you have implemented something for a long time, you tend to start to unintentionally drift away from the standardized ways that, in this case, an intervention could be administered. And so what happens is over time, you're implementing something, but you've kind of gotten rid of a few things that maybe you don't like, and you've added in some other things that you do like. And at the end of the day, you're implementing something, but probably not the intervention in the way that it was validated through research. So measuring fidelity really helps us at the system level ensure that we're providing support to the people that are implementing various interventions and programs. Having data helps us look at the effectiveness of our universal instruction, our tier 2 supports, our tier 3 supports. So how many of you can put in the chat, are using some type of a progress monitoring tool, Gibbons or FastBridge or AimsWeb? There's several of them out there. Lots of places that I go are doing a good job with progress monitoring. But what I find happens is all of these programs are really good at producing a graph. So there's a goal line of where you want the student to be, and then you collect data and it tells you, oh, yep, this student's making progress, or no, this student isn't making good progress. So when I go sit in on data meetings, people are getting really good at like looking at the graphs and, oh, is this working or is it not working? But usually when they see a graph with data that's kind of flat, not showing a lot of progress, people automatically jump to, oh, the intervention didn't work. But if you don't have information on fidelity, you can't answer the question, did it work or not? The only way that you can figure out if it's really working is to ensure that intervention or program is being implemented with this broadened fidelity model that I'm going to share with you in a sec. So we really want to focus on what we're doing. And a lot of people say, well, why should I care? And I'm just going to share a quick little study by a woman by the name of Catherine Wickstrom. She did this for her dissertation, and she was hired in a district to come out and teach elementary teachers how to use mystery motivators. And a mystery motivator is an incentive for kids to display appropriate behavior, but they don't know what the reward or the incentive is going to be. So you hype it up and you say, oh, this is a really big deal. And, you're going to be so excited when you meet your goal. So I won't go into any more detail about it, but she came out and did a full day of training on how to implement a mystery motivator program in the classroom. And then she came back and she asked the teachers that attended the workshop, how many of you are actually implementing the mystery motivator program? And what do you think the percentage would be of all the people that attended? How many people percentage do you think actually were implementing it? You can put it in the chat, or if you're following along, you'll see the answer on the PowerPoint. So 54% of the people that were trained said, yep, I'm implementing it. But now what do you think happened when she actually went out and did some direct observations to see of those 54% of people that said they're implementing were actually implementing with Fidelity? 4%. 4% of the 54. So when I see measures of fidelity happening out in the field, most of the time it's self-report. So it's either a check mark on a form that says, is the intervention being implemented with fidelity? And you check that box, or you ask the people. But from my experience as a practitioner, and maybe it's because I'm in Minnesota, where the nickname for Minnesota is Minnesota Nice, because people are generally pretty nice. But when you ask someone, well, how's that intervention working? 9 times out of 10, I'm going to hear the word fine. Oh, everything's going fine. Some people have referred to fine as kind of the educational F word. So you can't just take people's word for it. We have to have systems in place to ensure fidelity, because within an MTSS framework, we're allocating resources to try to solve a problem, and we want to use our resources wisely. Without checking on fidelity, we aren't sure if the intervention's being applied as designed. And if it's not being applied as designed, then progress or lack thereof really can't be allocated to the specific plan. So implementation is low. And I mean, we have to remember that there's a bunch of different data that we're looking at. And some of the data is the kids producing data, their test scores, their benchmark tests, their progress monitoring. But that cause data is a lot of different behaviors and teacher behaviors and staff behaviors and leadership behaviors. So we have to really focus in on fidelity. And I am going to argue a broader conception of fidelity. So this is my fidelity wheel, and you'll see that there's 7 steps to it. I would say most of the time, people are either focusing on adherence, which is, are we following the standard procedures of the intervention? And then the second is exposure and duration, like what's the dosage, how long, how often, how frequently. But really, I'm going to kind of walk us through this wheel and talk about these other things, like starting with a well-defined need of the student, matching that need to an evidence-based practice, making sure that the person that's delivering the intervention is engaged and bought in, providing training to the people that are doing interventions, making sure that students are engaged during the intervention. So adherence and exposure and duration are important, but all of these other things are too. So the student-facing side of the wheel is really these factors related to the delivery of an effective practice with fidelity. And then we have some adult-facing factors that are related to selecting evidence-based practices and supporting interventionists to take on the delivery of those factors. So we have quality indicators that are increasing the probability of a program, how to select a quality program, and then creating systems that support the adults to implement. So each of these core elements of Fidelity, there's a corresponding question that goes along with each one. So we're going to start out with the first thing, which is there a well-defined need? So the question is, what's the specific outcome of interest? What's that area of need that we're going to address through an effective practice? But before I get to that, the overarching big ideas are that 7 pieces of Fidelity implies that it is more complex than just focusing on one thing. We need to have a collaborative culture in place in order to have discussions around Fidelity. This is never a punitive evaluation of the implementer, and we should view that collecting this data helps everyone, from the trainer to the teacher, the interventionist, or the student, to improve. So it should never be perceived as punitive. So having a well-defined need is really important. There's a researcher by the name of Tony Brake who wrote a book called Learning to Improve, which is a fabulous book, and it's all about improvement science. But he says that our country is suffering from an affliction called solutionitis. And solutionitis happens when we jump really quickly on a solution to a problem before we really understand what the problem is. And then what happens is popular ideas move really quickly. Each of these new ideas or programs or practices becomes the new hammer, but oftentimes they lack an evidence base. And so what happens is solutionitis turns into initiative fatigue because we're busy jumping on the bandwagon of new programs and practices. Then they don't work because they're not well matched to a need. And then we're on to the next thing. And that's really tiring for educators. I don't know how many of you have ever been in a situation like that. I have been, and it is just exhausting. You just about feel like you're getting a handle on something, and then wham, it all changes like overnight. So well-defined needs requires us to really operationalize the specific literacy need that the student is having so that we have an actionable definition that we can then link to an evidence-based intervention. So thinking about the group, when we talk about tier 2, we're usually talking about small groups of students. When we talk about tier 3, it's a little bit more individualized down to the individual student. But if we think about a well-defined need at the group level, what we're really trying to do here is identify a problem. And a problem is defined as a discrepancy or a difference between what we expect and what's occurring. So if we take a group example here, we could see that from our FastBridge or our Dibbles data, only 45% of first graders have met the fall literacy benchmark. So that's what's occurring. And what's expected is that we're going to have at least 80% of students. And we're not picking 80% because we're in love with 80%. 80% is really coming at a resource allocation framework and model that most schools don't have the resources to provide interventions to more than about 20% of students. So 80% is kind of that good test of your tier 1 instruction. So we know we have a problem because we're getting 45%, we are expecting 80%, but now we need to know why. And the why is really going to help us broadly understand the root cause of the problem so that we can select an effective solution. So here, the hypothesis for this example is because the students have not yet mastered letter-sound correspondence and blending sounds to make words. So now we're going to pick an evidence-based intervention. And in this case, there is an actual intervention program called PALS, Peer Assisted Learning Strategies. And there's one for kindergarten called KPALS, which helps teach students letter sound correspondence and how to blend sound to make words, or it could be more small group instruction. If we switch over to an individual student, we might see that Ben is reading 25 words correct per minute in the fall of second grade with 95% accuracy. And we're expecting that students will read at least 50 words per minute with 95% accuracy. So we know, again, that we have that discrepancy between what's expected and what's occurring. But now the why is because Ben needs to increase his reading fluency skills. So he's reading with 95% accurate, however, his rate is low. So any type of repeated reading intervention will be really good for these types of kids. But I tell you what, since all of these assessment systems have become popular in the last 20 years, 10 years, what I see now a lot is that people are printing out their FastBridge or their AimsWeb or their Dibble scores, and then they're looking at all the kids that rate is below target without looking at accuracy, and then having those kids all do repeated reading interventions. Repeated reading will not work if you are having kids read repeatedly out of material that they can't read with 95% or greater accuracy. All they're going to do is practice their errors. So this is a good example of using some screening data to identify a need for Ben, and there's probably other kids like Ben that could benefit from this intervention in the classroom. So we start with a well-defined need, and then we jump next to program specificity. That is, are we using an evidence-based intervention that's aligned to Tier 1 that can be useful for providing supplemental intervention to students? So we want to start with a standardized evidence-based program, because when our evidence-based programs are aligned to kids' needs, they tend to work. And so there's no need for us to reinvent the wheel. And we've got lots of different sources where we can start to find evidence-based interventions, which I'll share a few with you in a minute. They're efficient, so teachers can plan instruction for groups of kids rather than just one kid at a time. Many of the interventions, they do require training, but it's not like you have to go to an 8-hour workshop on how to do it. And oftentimes paraeducators can actually really help with the delivery of some of them. And some of them are often inexpensive. So fidelity is really hard to measure if the intervention is not well defined. So that's always kind of a first broad stroke, is if you can't define the intervention, it's probably lacking in evidence base, because you have to have really clear procedures and steps in order to validate that. And then we want to make sure that the criteria meets the intervention meets the criteria for evidence-based. I strongly recommend that if you haven't done this already, a really good activity for your grade level teams or your PLC teams is to do an intervention inventory and just take stock of the different interventions that are used at each grade level and for which problem. And that can form the basis to start kind of evaluating the evidence base. Unfortunately, if you ask the question, what works in terms of producing some type of a change in a behavior that you want to see changed, the answer is just about anything will produce some type of an effect. But when we're talking about Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, we want to know what works best. Like, from all the alternatives, what are those ones that are really going to accelerate student progress so that kids are going to close the gap and make more than a year's worth of progress in a year's time? So thinking about evidence-based, I think it's good to just compare evidence-based to research-based. Sometimes these words are used interchangeably. Evidence-based means that the program or practice has been studied in a controlled setting, usually through an experimental or a quasi-experimental study, and it's been shown to be effective. Research-based interventions are a program or practice that's developed on the best available research on what is effective. So it might take a lot of the components from an evidence base, from the research, and put that into a practice, but that practice hasn't necessarily been specifically studied in a controlled setting. So when we ask ourselves, what is an evidence-based practice? We start with an actionable problem. Then we select an evidence-based practice. Then we implement it in our context, and then we evaluate it. And we evaluate it through progress monitoring. Progress monitoring is so important because you never really know in advance what's gonna 100% work for an individual student. Evidence-based practices are a really good start, but the only way you're really gonna know is to implement it and monitor progress and make decisions based on student data. So it's really a matter of looking at the best available evidence that's out there. What are the resources that you have available in your building? Who are the people? What is their expertise? And then what are the student characteristics, the values, the preferences? And it's really that in that Venn diagram, it's in the middle of that where they all intersect, which is what we're shooting for. So put really simply, we're trying to figure out what works for whom and under what set of circumstances. So when we look at ESSA's definition of evidence-based is based on the type of study. So strong evidence is at least one well-designed and well-implemented experimental study. And that's usually a randomized control where you will randomly assign students to a treatment group and a control group and compare the outcomes. The moderate definition is at least one well-designed and well-implemented quasi-experimental study. So using some type of a matched control rather than random assignment. And then promising is one well-designed and well-implemented correlational study to control bias. But always remember that correlation does not imply causation. We can't get to causation with a correlational study. So the other thing, because I'm going to show you a couple of websites that are helpful, but we need to understand the definition of evidence-based through ESSA. And then we also have to understand what an effect size is. Have any of you followed the work of John Hattie with visible learning? Yep, I see a couple hands go up. So that was a great book that really took a bunch of different educational programs, practices, policies, and he calculated effect sizes for every single practice and then put them on a barometer. So Hattie's definition is that a strong effect size was anything above 0.4. Those were going to be practices that would really accelerate growth. If you go out and do a lit review, you can see here a strong effect is 0.50 or larger, so right in line with Hattie. Moderate, 0.23, 0.35 to 0.49, and small, 0.25 to 0.34. So this is where it gets tricky because we've got some different websites out there to help us select evidence-based practices. How many of you have heard of or used the What Works Clearinghouse? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, so here's the deal with What Works Clearinghouse. Sometimes people could say that the What Works Clearinghouse is the What Doesn't Work Clearinghouse, but the problem with What Works Clearinghouse is that they base their evaluations based on the study design and not necessarily what the effect size is. So that's one reason why LLI or level literacy intervention shows up as being a strong intervention, because guess what? There was one or two random control studies. But when you actually look at the effect sizes, it's negligible. It's actually under 0.10. So there's just these caveats that we need to start to figure out. Now, the National Center for Intensive Interventions, they also have a tool chart and intervention tools, and they will show effect sizes. Some of these other ones won't show effect sizes, but they'll show like a percent mean difference or a standardized mean difference, and it's not always apples to apples. So I actually feel I feel really sorry and sad for educators, because you would think that these websites, I mean, they are helpful in starting to look at things, but you really have to know what you're looking at and understand that what's to me way more impressive is, rather than one study, is the hallmark of science is replication. So to have 10 studies or 50 studies that are all converging and they've been replicated and they show that they work for students. So just a few things to keep in mind. And I'm sorry we can't go super deep right now in the time that we have allotted, but I'm kind of trying to give you like the high level sound bites here to help you make an informed decision. Be careful if you have too many interventions, and that's why I think it's helpful to do an intervention inventory, because if you have too many interventions, the chances are that it's better to have a few really good interventions matched to a need than to have a whole laundry list to select from, because that will usually impact fidelity of interventions. So in your, there's a link on here to an intervention inventory from the National Center on Intensive Intervention, if that's something that you're interested in trying out. Okay, so the next thing on our wheel is, how engaged is the person delivering the intervention? Do they think it's, have they bought into it? Do they think it's acceptable? How many of you have sat in a team meeting where a conversation goes like this? You're talking about an intervention, and it actually has a good evidence base behind it with a strong effect size. But a couple people are like, yep, I tried that. And that didn't work. I mean, I can't tell you how many meetings I've sat in. So I told you, I've been an administrator for 28 years, and the younger Kim was a little bit more impatient. And when I would hear things like that, I think to myself, well, how come you just get to say that you don't think this is that it works without any data and without looking at fidelity? But older Kim, I just turned 56, is a little bit more patient. And I understand now that if you try to take a dictator approach and say, you know what, you might not like the intervention, but this is what we're going to do, and we're going to get you trained and you're going to implement it. You can do that, but what are the chances that that person's actually going to implement something that they really don't believe in their heart of hearts? It's going to impact fidelity. So what we know is that most intervention people that are going to implement an intervention buy in when something's easier to implement rather than super complex, when it's more positive in nature, if they think that they perceive that it's effective, and if it's compatible with the instructional environment. So in your resource folder, sorry, I've had too much Diet Coke, so I'm starting to talk kind of fast here, but in your resource folder, there are some implementation acceptability measures. There's the IAM and the IRP, which is an intervention rating profile that you can give to a teacher to see what their level of buy-in might be. if you have resistant folks, there is actually a research line about how to reduce resistance among intervention implementers. And okay, Tammy, I see the link isn't working. I'll make sure that I recheck that. I thought I did. I'll recheck it at the end to make sure everybody has access.
It might just be me. That's why I was.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Is it working for anybody else? Okay, well, I'll double check and I'll make sure that I update it. So there's actually a line of research about test driving intervention. So how many of you, when you are going to buy a car, test drive a few things to figure out like what's comfortable, what's good for me? You can't tell from me sitting down, but I'm 6'1", so I'm tall. So I need something where I got some headroom and I feel comfortable in it. Well, the idea around test driving interventions is a good study from 2012 found that teachers who are resistant to implementing new strategies implemented with higher rates of fidelity when they were able to test drive a few different interventions and select the one that they found most effective. So in order to make that work, we need to have some student engagement data that we collect, and we need to make sure that we're implementing with fidelity. But you basically, instead of forcing, you offer a couple of good alternatives and said, hey, would you mind just testing out these couple of interventions, and we're going to collect some data and then we'll get back together and we'll review the data. Just being able, just like with kids with behavioral problems, it's always good to give kids choice. Turns out it's not a bad thing for adults either. Like let's give them a choice. Let's look at the data and then make some decisions. So we want to really try to get buy-in from people that are implementing. So it's important that we think about 5 questions. Is this important to me as the teacher? Do I think it's doable? How will this impact my students that I'm for doing this? How long is the intervention going to last? What help am I going to do to get this right? So intervention engagement. The next one is training and support. Anybody here ever watched the show House? It's not been on the air for like 10 years, 15 years, but Dr. House is like a forensic medical person that's always trying to, figure out some elusive medical diagnosis. So I think this is a funny little clip here.
Well, sometimes doctors make mistakes. Anna, you need to try twice as hard to fix them. Are you using your inhaler?
All the time. Go through one a week.
You sure you're using it right?
Do I look like an idiot?
No. Why don't you show me how your inhaler works?
So as the parent of 2 children with asthma, this was very meaningful to me because one of my kids was having an asthma attack all the time. And I'd be like, are you using your inhaler? Yeah, I'm using my inhaler. Well, then they came out with the inhalers where it actually showed how many doses they've taken. So I could catch them and say, no, your inhaler is at 2 right now. That means you've used it twice in the last month. But really what this is speaking to is that we can't expect people to just implement a new strategy without any training. And what we know is that it is not uncommon for educators to receive a single training on a policy or practice and then be expected to go implement it on their own. It happens all the time when I go out and work with districts. I always meet with the intervention teachers. I ask them what interventions they're using, and I ask them when they were last trained. And I'd say about 50% of the time they're not trained. Somebody has put a manual in their mailbox and said, here, read this and then go implement it. Or if they were trained, it might have been 8 years ago. And, remember back to drift, like we need to have some refresher trainings. So we know for adults that about 20% of adults will learn something just by seeing, just by reading something, 10% just by listening, but most people need direct, purposeful experiences. So we want to make sure that we're providing good training and support, that I'm going to tell you about how to create some fidelity checklists. It's important. The good thing about fidelity checklists, which kind of scope out what the steps of the intervention is, when you have a checklist, you can use it for training, and you can do some practicing where you take turns, where if I'm teaching you the intervention, I'm going to be the teacher, you're going to be the student. Then we're going to switch spots, and you can give me feedback, I'll give you feedback. But we want to make sure that people are really firm on the intervention that we're using. So a hallmark study about how teachers learn and apply what they've learned into practice is a Joyce and Shower study. It's from 1991. It's been replicated a lot. And so really quickly, like if you were going to come in and I was going to teach you a reading fluency intervention, and all I did was tell you about the research about why fluency is important, about 85% might kind of understand that, yeah, it's important to do fluency for kids that are slow but accurate. Only about 15% would know how to actually go do it and practice, and about 5 to 10% would try it out. Now, if I were to give you some modeling where I actually show you what it looks like, what do you think is going to happen to these numbers? Stay the same, go up? I see a go up. So we got a little bump on skill attainment, but we're kind of still stuck at application. So now I'm going to present the theory, I'm going to model it for you, and I'm going to have you practice and give you low risk feedback. Now what's going to happen? We're going to get there. So now we get a big bump in skill attainment, but it isn't until we add in coaching where we get that application. And that's when we talk about professional learning for literacy. Many states are now mandating. I'm helping lead reading reform in Minnesota through the Minnesota Read Act. And all teachers are required to be trained by 2027 under one of 3 programs: Letters, Core, or one that we developed at our center called Carry All. They're all good programs, but what we know, there's been research on Letters that it's really good, but it's actually hard to just go through Letters and then go back into a classroom on your own with a curriculum that maybe isn't well aligned and implement. So that's why most states that are requiring training are also requiring coaching. So the next one is exposure and duration, and that's getting at that dosage, how often and how long. So we're really trying to ask, is the intervention provided for a sufficient duration and intensity to allow for success as predicted by the evidence? Or is the intervention fitted to the time available? And I see this one a lot, that you can find a good intervention and it was validated at 40 minutes a day, 5 days a week, but we only have a 25-minute intervention block, and then you count transitions and you really only get the intervention for 17 minutes, maybe not even 5 days a week. So we need to think about dosage. And there's always this question, like how much time and how many days and how do we document? What's the data we're going to look at? The time is really based on the intensity of need. So tier 2 interventions, the research kind of says between 3 and 5 days a week for 25 to 30 minutes a session. And tier 3 is more intensive, more time. But the only time you're really going to know is if you monitor progress. So that's, again, why it's important is start with something, monitor progress. But if you're not implementing it with enough time and you're not getting good results in your data, that's a signal that you need to try to get up to that level of time. How many days? Start out at 3 days a week for tier 2, but the minute that you start not seeing a lot of progress, you're going to want to ramp that up and continue to collect data. This was a good study that was done by Amanda Vanderheiden, and it's on math, but I think the results are generalizable. She wanted to compare an intervention for math fact families in 4th grade. And so that you see these 4 lines, and let me go back here. Okay, so here's daily. Here's twice a week. Here's once a week. And here's the control group. So she found that kids made more progress rather than one 50-minute session to do it in smaller doses every day. So daily 10 minutes was superior in this. And really the reason that why I want to point that out is one of the one of the practices that has a high effect size from Hattie is called spaced practice. And it's that whole notion of continuous review. So incorporating daily review of previous learned skills, that's really going to help kiddos that are behind. They need repetition and they need practice to get that converted to their long-term memory. So we need to think about, is the dosage determined based on some predetermined schedule, or is it based on the requirements? Is it based on student needs? Is it based on recommendations from a team? And really be thinking about intensity. I'm going to talk about intensifying interventions in the last session, but we want to make sure that our tier 3 interventions are actually more intensive than tier 2 supplemental interventions. So almost through our wheel, the 6th one is student engagement. How engaged and involved are the students in the intervention? So when we talk about engagement, we can talk about academic engagement, which is behaviors related, to how actively engaged are they during the learning process. We can talk about social engagement, following written and unwritten classroom rules of behavior, coming to school on time. We can talk about cognitive engagement, and that's how do we kind of persist and work through a difficult task and keep on working. And then affective, like feelings of involvement in school and feeling like you belong. But what we know about academic engagement is students who exhibit academic engagement behaviors tend to achieve at higher levels than peers that are less engaged. Strong correlations between paying attention and student achievement, and that regardless of age group or other risk factors, there are significant negative correlations between lack of attention and reading achievement, which I know doesn't surprise any of you. This is a Check and Connect is an engagement program for older kids to help them stay in school. And finally, our last one is adherence, and that's how well are we sticking to the plan. So again, here is where checklists become really common. I use checklists a lot just in my everyday life because it helps me organize and prioritize, reminds me, helps me kind of track my progress. But there's all types of checklists that we can use for Fidelity. We have a statewide survey in Minnesota that goes out to all districts where they can track their MTSS implementation. We have intervention scripts and checklists to look at integrity of interventions. We can look at integrity of fidelity of progress monitoring. If you're using FASPR, James Webb, Dibbles, and you want to be monitoring progress once a week, look at your graph. Do you have data points once a week? We can have grade level team agendas and notes, problem solving teams. So there's lots of different ways. I'm just going to talk to you about creating an implementation fidelity assessment for an intervention. So we're going to select a measure, and we usually are going to, let me go to the next slide. We're going to chunk it out and really look at the intervention and what are the steps? What are the steps that need to be followed? We're going to share it with teachers and get their feedback, co-edit, practice using the measures, make it really low threat. Like this isn't about evaluation. It's just about measuring whether we're giving enough support. We want to make sure that we don't have more than about 10 items. We want them to be time bound. So it's kind of like a lesson plan for the interventions about how much time per step. And, oh, sorry. So I'm not sure why this got duplicated. And I'm just going to leave you with there in your folder, and I'll make sure it's linked. There's some research-based practice interventions for literacy that have been used statewide in our AmeriCorps program here, where volunteers come in and do tutoring with kids, and they've evaluated these and found good effects. So one of those interventions is called duet reading. And that's where students and teachers alternate saying words out loud as they read the same passage together. And it helps provide a support for tracking and a delayed model for accurate reading, and helps establish a reading pace. So you need short texts that the students can read with at least 95% accuracy, and long enough that the student will be able to almost complete the passage in 1 minute after practicing. And then we do a set of readings where the student reads the passage out loud all by themselves. The first time, the teacher's correcting errors with a standard error correction procedure. The second reading is the teacher and student take turns reading every other word, and the teacher starts first, follow the error correction procedures. The third time, they alternate and the student starts first. And the fourth reading, the student reads it on their own. So here's an example of, and this is in your folder, of taking that procedure and turning it into an intervention script that you can then have somebody go in and observe, did they follow all of the steps? So let's see, winding down here, we should have just a couple minutes for questions. What's the magic number for fidelity? Like, so if you have a checklist with 10 items, is it 80%? I'm in an ongoing argument about it. I think it really depends if you say, well, yep, it's implemented with fidelity 80%. But what if it's a repeated reading and step one is that they're reading a passage that they can read with 95% accuracy and they miss that? That's actually really important. So I don't know. I'm still on the fence about this. I think it requires some more discussion. But let's see. But I do want you to think about when you're collecting progress monitoring data and you have implementation fidelity, if you have good student performance and good fidelity, then you should interpret and act on that information. If you have good data, good student performance data, but questionable implementation data, you want to drill down and coach the interventionist. So again, if you've got good fidelity but poor performance, then we want to consider changing the intervention. So this is just meant to show you how important fidelity is. So again, and ending with, this is a little bit complex, but we need a collaborative culture. We're not evaluating the implementer, and it should never be a punitive exercise. So I think I have 3 minutes to answer some questions. You can either unmute or send it in the chat. And you can also email me. I've got my email up there if you don't want to share your question.